Imagine a ruthless white cop on a rural farm, dragging a disabled black grandmother through the filthy mud with a tractor, laughing like he owns the world because she dared to stand up on her land. What didn't he expect? Her daughter is a fierce federal judge ready to crush him and expose his disgusting hate for all to see. This isn't just violence, it's a brutal warning. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and watch till the end, because the payoff will leave you speechless. The late afternoon shadows stretched long across the rutted lane leading up to the old farmhouse. Two dim yellow bulbs cast weak pools of light around the front gate, barely pushing back the dusk that settled over the surrounding fields. In that half-light stood Esther, a frail, elderly black woman supported by a wooden cane and leaning on the lintel of her gate. She lived here alone, miles from town and from her daughter Lena, who worked in the city and rarely visited to avoid worrying her elderly mother. They met as sisters. The only company Esther had was the crickets, the distant hum of tractors, and memories of a life cinched by hardship and small joys alike. Ahead of her, the sharp click of boots echoed on the cracked concrete driveway. Mason, a white police officer recently assigned to this rural precinct, advanced with measured steps. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor cold and self-contained. In one hand he carried a baton, in the other a flashlight that only hollowly illuminated his stern features. He paused under the weakest of the yellow bulbs, shadows sharpening his cheekbones, giving his posture a predatory edge. "Out of here," he said, his voice low, abrasive, an intrusion into the silence, a warning tone. "Old lady, don't get in the way of this land." Esther's breath hitched. She straightened herself as best she could, clutching her cane. "I live here," she managed, voice trembling. "I'm not causing trouble." Her words came through shaky and soft, laced with fear but holding on to courtesy. Mason stepped closer, baton moving with precise intent. "You don't belong here," he said, eyes narrowing. "Black folk always stir up trouble." His words dangled in the air, jagged and personal, dripping with prejudice. To him, Esther wasn't a resident, but an intrusion, not human in her right to live where she chose. She tried to shake her head, pressing a hand against the gate for support. "I only live here, sir." Peacefully, Mason let his sentence hang, a pause, heavy and poised before he advanced another step forward. "You hear me?" he repeated, more loudly this time, as if her life depended on it. "Go back where you belong before I make you." Esther closed her eyes, blinking back tears that her body was too tired to hold. She bit her lip to keep from crying. Instead she whispered, "Please, I've been here 50 years." Mason's face didn't soften. With a glance toward his shoulder, he signaled silently to his partner, or to a fellow officer waiting outside the pool of light. That officer shifted slightly, positioning themselves at the ready to intervene if Mason said the word. Esther lifted her head, leaning heavily on her cane. She stared at the ground, unsure whether to retreat, plead, or stand her ground, but all the energy to move had fled from her body. Mason took another step, glaring directly at her. "You hear me?" he barked. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." This was no question. It was an ultimatum, forced on a vulnerable woman at the edge of her home. As the crickets chirped and bats flitted overhead, Esther stood rooted in place. Mason turned away abruptly, a hand in dismissal. Behind him, his colleague moved forward to stand guard near the gate, flashlight scanning the dim perimeter. Mason's silhouette lunged into the deeper shadows, taking one last look before he stepped fully out of sight. The sun was sinking fast behind the tree line, casting a dim, uneven glow over the weather-worn buildings near the workers' quarters. The red clay underfoot had turned to slick mud, a treacherous mix of moisture and clay that sucked at every cautious step. It was nearly dusk, the kind that feels colder than it should, with shadows long enough to hide dangers. Esther stood in that saturated ground, her cane planted firmly as she tried to steady herself against the earth's pull. She looked tiny beside the squat buildings of the workers' barracks, ramshackle and low, with a few solitary light bulbs sputtering in the windows. A hush had fallen over the scattered residents. Several locals lingered across the mud, hesitating, exchanging nervous glances. No one wanted to get too close. Mason's presence had transformed the fields into something tense and unpredictable. Officer Mason stood only a few feet from Esther. He held his baton in one hand. With his other, he flicked off the flashlight that illuminated his stern features. He didn't need the beam now. He could see her. He was calm, but his posture was commanding, a new kind of authority, unsettling, inflexible. "I can toss you in jail," he said evenly, baton thumbed restlessly in his hand. "Charge you with disturbing the peace, maybe even trespassing." His words were clipped, deliberate. The locals tensed, mouths closed, eyes narrowing. A woman muttered behind Esther's back, "Qu'en sait-tu?" Esther swallowed hard. She raised a trembling hand to her chest. I'm just trying to live quietly," she stammered, voice barely above a breath. "I'm not causing any trouble." Mason narrowed his gaze. "You're black, aren't you? And you think that gives you the right to be here?" His tone dipped into cruel mockery. "Black folks are always stirring trouble, always pushing boundaries. But not here." Esther shook her head, one tear escaping her closed eyes. I've lived here for 50 years, worked this land, planted, harvested. I pay taxes." His lips curled into a cold grin. "It doesn't matter. You crossed me tonight." He took another step forward, bringing him within inches of her. The mud squelched under his boots. "So leave, now, before I decide how long you rot behind bars." A few neighbors in the mud shifted position, stepping back. No one dared speak. Esther leaned heavily on her cane. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to gather courage, but her hands shook noticeably. She tried again. "Please, just let me stay. I've done nothing wrong." Mason scoffed. He glanced sideways at his partner, standing by the barn door. Without a word, he nodded once. His partner took a step forward and reached toward Esther, a light tug at her arm. Mason watched with an alien calm. There was no empathy on his face, only a quiet decree of dominance. This wasn't a conversation. It was a command. Esther's shoulders sagged under the minstrel weight of his baton's shadow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mason raised his baton in a casual yet unmistakable signal. His partner stepped closer, and gently but firmly guided Esther sideways, deeper into the barren yard, away from her gate, away from the protection it might have offered. Mason met the silent witnesses with cold, measured eyes, as if daring any of them to interfere. The mud squelched, mixing with the silence around them. In that moment, the threat felt absolute. A crossing line. Esther's small form trailed behind the officers, inch by inch, until she could barely return to her familiar property line. Mason lingered, baton resting on his shoulder, and then finally gave a curt nod. "Stay out after dark again. I'll find another reason to lock you up." His voice carried easily into the settling evening. His partner released Esther completely, stepping back to stand guard. Mason turned on his heel and walked off, the echo of wet boots disappearing into the dusk. Neighbors exhaled collectively, relieved but shaken, watching him leave. Esther pulled herself upright, bracing against her cane in the cold mud. She gazed at the receding figure and whispered, "I have nowhere else." As the twilight deepened, the threat lodged itself in her chest, not only for her body but for the legacy of fear such words carry. In that soil she had found her home, but tonight it was tainted. The air around the overgrown shrubs lining the farm's makeshift lane felt thick and heavy. Threads of dusk slipped through the branches, stitching long shadows over the cracked, muddy earth. The hush held steady, only broken by the distant hum of insects settling for the night. Esther stood alone, her frail frame silhouetted by the dying light. Her cane's wooden tip sank slightly into the mud as she tried to steady herself, her breath visible in the cooling air. She had come here to check the tool shed, to settle the day's chores. No one expected confrontation. No one expected hate. Closer now, Mason advanced in rigid steps. He was less than 6 feet away, his chest out, shoulders squared, exuding unwavering confidence. In one hand he clutched his baton like a scepter of authority. No flashlight. He didn't need one. He saw her perfectly. He paused. Then he spoke, his voice razor-sharp. "Law belongs to the whites now," he bellowed, and each word fell like a hammer strike. "You? You're not part of it." The sound cut through the quiet. Neighbors flinched, recoiling into the shadows. Esther's heart pounded uncontrollably. She lifted a trembling hand to plead, but Mason was already reaching to yank the cane from her grip. He ripped it away in one sharp motion. The cane fell into the mud with a hollow thud. Esther gasped, stumbling sideways. Her knees buckled as he shoved her. "Get into the mud," he barked. The shove sent her toppling, sliding a few feet down the slick slope. She landed in a shallow pool, mud along her sleeve and skirt. Esther curled into herself, eyes squeezed shut, mud oozing into every fold of her clothing. Another neighbor cursed under his breath. No one moved to help. Mason stood over her, chest heaving with dry breath. "Now you know your place," he said, voice low and domineering. "Try to act like you belong, or I'll shove you deeper next time." She peered up through lashes, pain and shame etched across her face. He tilted his head, scanning the onlookers. Then he smirked, a cruel twitch of lips, and turned his head slightly toward the fence. He looked again at the tool shed, then back at the cane lying useless in the mud. Mason's eyes trained on the mud-covered cane in the puddle by Esther's hand, then flicked to the bulk of the tractor parked a few yards away. Without a word, he glanced at his partner. The partner nodded. Attention passed, a silent plan taking form. Esther began to gather herself, her shirt and skirt soaked and heavy. She reached for her cane, but the mud held it fast. She struggled to free it. Mason advanced once more, baton tapping lightly on the sole of his boot. The locals watched from a distance, still too fearful to intervene, but too invested to turn away. The cane slipped from her grasp, sinking deeper into the waterlogged ground. Mason paused, chest heaving. "I told you! You're no one here!" Then he raised his baton in a deliberate gesture, pausing, tilting his head slightly toward the fenced-off tractor. It was a signal. His partner stepped forward and guided Esther with a firm hand, urging her to stand and pull herself away from the mess. The neighbors exhaled quietly as Esther steadied herself. She stared, haunted, at the tractor's silhouette in the half-light. Mason took a final look around before lifting his baton in dismissal. He turned and walked back toward the fence and the tractor, leaving the cane buried in mud. Esther picked herself up unsteadily, mud-slicked and shaken. A few meters behind, the others followed her silently. The cane was abandoned in the bog. She trudged away on trembling legs. As Mason disappeared behind the shadows of the barn, the threat lingered in the air. He had taken her dignity, stripped her weapon, and left her exposed. A reminder of how power and hate can reshape a moment into trauma. The sun sloped even lower the moment Mason slumped into the driver's seat of the ancient tractor. The air was thick with the smell of fresh mud and warm metal, and the engine sputtered twice before hiccuping into a deep, mechanical growl. A red glow from the dashboard flickered in the dimming light. As Mason planted his foot on the accelerator, Esther lay face down in the mire, her dress soaked to the hem in wet clay. She had attempted to rise once earlier, but had collapsed again, her breathing shallow and her frame trembling from pain and humiliation. The cane she prized lay broken and useless a few yards away. In the tractor's cab, Mason's hard eyes tracked her. He'd been silent until now, quiet, confident. The engine's rumble filled the space. He revved it again, as if waking an angry beast, and then drove forward. Mud exploded beneath the tractor's front tires, spraying across nearby reeds and the dilapidated tool shed. Mason steered deliberately toward Esther, slow and methodical. She managed to prop herself up on one arm, eyes wide with shock and dread, but she could not scrape herself free from the mud's tight grip. The tractor's bumper inched dangerously close to her head, an agonizing moment of suspended violence. Then Mason drove the machine full forward. The wheel caught at Esther's leg. She screamed, a terrible, broken sound. The tractor dragged her centimeters at a time, her body scraping over roots and stones, and it felt endless. She was a spectacle of force and fear. Mud-covered, partially submerged, every movement labored, constitutional dignity shredded by a hate-fueled act of aggression. The crowd of local uninvolved onlookers shivered at the sight, but remained frozen. Mason finally killed the engine. The roar died. He climbed down silently, ignoring the rasped, wheezing noises leaking from Esther's lungs. He looked briefly, with cold detachment, at the battered remnant of her cane. It lay beneath the tractor, crushed beyond use. He gave one slow, dismissive wave and turned away toward the tool shed, leaving behind the fragrant, churned mud and Esther's fractured presence. His silhouette slipped into the gathering gloom. The onlookers reacted late. A trembling groan escaped. Then an elderly man, barely mobile but determined, lunged forward. A younger neighbor followed. They reached Esther within moments. Gently, carefully, they rolled her onto one side, propping her arm under her back. The older man supported her other side so she could stand. Each toe was pulled hard from the mud. She gasped at the cold, her dress stuck and heavy. Another neighbor grabbed her under the arms and lifted her to her feet. She wept softly at the pain radiating through her leg and the humiliation of the ordeal, though there was no time or right to pity her. They guided her slowly toward an idling truck at the edge of the field. She leaned on the truck's side, gasping and still coated in wet clay. No one spoke as the engine started. The truck crept forward, leaving behind a scene that would later be described in police reports, news clips, social media tags, and legal documents. The smell of fuel drifted in the heavy twilight. Mason and his backup officers were nowhere in sight. Their retreat was quiet and intentional, as though the violence had consumed the moment, and they vanished like ghosts. But the evidence remained: tire treads etched in mud, the cane destroyed, a battered woman needing help, and hatred made material. The control room at Justice Voices was bathed in an urgent mix of red and blue from overhead LED lights, setting the tone for a broadcast that demanded attention. Jamal, the show's host, sat behind his large desk, microphone open, camera rolling, and two sound engineers leaning over mixing boards. The studio's walls were lined with a mosaic of posters and news clippings, scenes of protests, civil rights rallies, and the show's mantra, truth, justice, voices. Jamal's eyes flicked to his encrypted inbox. He watched as a video file from an unknown anonymized user uploaded silently, tracker_clip_3, MP4. The thumbnail shook him. Esther, face down in mud, the tractor's tire looming millimeters from her arm. He motioned to his team. Lights stayed on, Lenny raised her camera, and Cortez adjusted audio levels. Jamal pressed play. The clip opened with motion blur, then focused. Mud spraying, Esther struggling, the tractor rolling forward, Mason silent at the wheel. It lasted 18 seconds before cutting. The studio paused. A single click, and the room ignited. Jamal leaned forward into the camera. Good evening. We just received this anonymous footage showing an elderly black woman, Esther, being dragged through mud by a tractor. She's hurt, Vulnerable. We believe this is a hate-motivated assault. This is what hate-given power looks like. Watch. He replayed the footage twice. On the second pass, he spoke over it. Look at the tractor wheel. Close enough to crush her. Watch how it hits her cane. That's violence with intent. He paused the footage at the precise moment the cane cracked under steel. The chat exploded. Rage emojis, hearts, messages demanding to know her identity. Jamal shifted to context. We tracked it to a farm on the outskirts of town yesterday. Tonight we're connecting evidence, voices, and legal context. He opened a fresh browser tab and posted FBI hate crime stats. 862 hate crime incidents in 2023. 862 hate crime incidents in 2023. 862 hate crime incidents in 2023. The numbers appeared on screen. Bold text against dramatic visuals of courthouse scenes. Folks, Jamal continued, this isn't an outlier. This is part of a growing plague. Hate crimes at record highs, physical violence, intimidation, and tonight, you've seen one firsthand. He dialed in attorney Simone Rivers, reaching her via video call. She appeared on the side monitor, sterile office behind her. Monroe? Jamal looked at her. Attorney. The answer? Jamal asked. Did you see it? Simone watched twice. That's intentional, she said, voice tight. That's an assault. And that cane, it's familiar. What do you mean? Jamal pressed. She described the fence-line cane as distinctive, then paused. Jamal, that gate belongs to Judge Lena Evans's mother, Esther Evans. Silence settled. Jamal blinked, composed himself, then turned to the camera. Tonight, I need all of you to listen. The victim is the mother of Judge Lena Evans, a sitting judge in the city. This is no longer just a tragedy, it's personal. But it's not just one life. It could be yours or mine or anyone else targeted by hate. The chat flooded with "Justice for Esther" in bold digital protests. Jamal turned back to Simone. You think we can reach Judge Evans? She needs to speak. This is too big. She must know, Simone replied. Jamal nodded slowly. Lena Evans, our next guest. He ended the live stream. Breaths held. The techs high-fived subtly. The clip was already trending. 100 chunters, 0 views within minutes. National news had picked it up. CNN and local affiliates prompting their legal teams to investigate. Jamal turned off the red light and exhaled slowly, adrenaline fading. He typed a secure message. Simone, call me when we have her. The stage was set for truth, justice, and the next wave of public demand. The lawyer's office in town was cluttered with case files, law books, and half-drunk coffee cups. Sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, dust motes dancing in the beams. An atmosphere of meticulous urgency. Attorney Simone Rivers, a seasoned black civil rights lawyer known for her unyielding advocacy, sat at the head of a long oak table. Across from her, her associate Marcus Lee scrutinized the same video that had shocked the nation. Meanwhile, on a mounted screen, Jamal appeared via encrypted video call. Simone leaned forward, eyes fixed on Esther's harrowing image, mud, pain, dehumanization. This is beyond assault, she declared, voice firm. This is a hate crime. Violent, targeted at her race, entirely intentional. She pressed a remote and paused the clip on Mason's calculated shove. Then again, on the exact moment the tractor's wheel crushed Esther's cane. Marcus closed his notebook. The way he yanked her cane pushed her down. This meets every criterion. Physical harm, racial bias, intimidation. The FBI defines hate crime as a crime motivated by bias toward a protected group. P+, a standard offense like assault. This fits exactly. Simone nodded, voice calm but resolute. 2023 FBI data shows 52.5% of hate crimes were race-based. We need the strongest public advocate. That's Judge Lena Evans, the victim's daughter. Her involvement would elevate this case, bring national legitimacy, and reduce defensive backlash citing bias or local politics. Jamal interjected from the screen. But may it be ethical? A judge suing? Simone smiled. She's not presiding this case. She'd act as special advisor, a high-profile witness, and community liaison. Her judicial status brings credibility, not judicial power here. Marcus added, it sends a clear message. This isn't just someone's private injustice, it's a community injustice. And with her voice, we can push for charges at both state and federal levels. Simone took a breath. I propose we formally request Lena's cooperation. We need her statement, on camera, plus court testimonies. She can help bring in a federal hate crime charge under 18 U.S.C. SS 249. We'll file coordination via the DOJ Civil Rights Division. Jamal nodded, his face serious. I'll reach out now. Simone concluded, prepare a secure briefing for her. Show the video, the data, the legal pathway. This isn't just about justice for Esther, it's about redefining accountability in our system. As Jamal clicked off, Simone and Marcus began drafting the pitch. Support from Judge Lena Evans, a call to justice and change. Judge Lena Evans sat at her polished mahogany desk in the city courthouse. Late afternoon sunlight filtering through the Venetian blinds. Law books lined the shelves behind her, certificates and commendations adorning the walls. Her assistant, Bishop, stood nearby organizing documents for the day's hearings. A soft ping from her phone drew Lena's attention. She glanced at the locked screen. Justice Voices, video clip. She tapped it open, expecting a routine update. Instead, a familiar face emerged. A frail, elderly woman, face down in mud, her cane crushed beneath a tractor tire. The image froze Lena in place. Is that? Lena's voice trailed off. Bishop heard it. That's her gait, Your Honor, Bishop said quietly, their voice taut with recognition. Her posture, the cane. That's your mother. Lena's heart pounded. She closed her eyes, breathing sharply. She had received vague texts from her mother, vague hints of distress. But Esther had insisted, don't worry me. Lena, just do your work. Now she realized why. Bishop set the phone on a black velvet mat. That's it. That's her. Lena stared at the screen, mind racing. She wanted to protect me, keep me from worrying, keep me focused on justice. She touched the cane in the video, and I just saw it destroyed. She looked at Bishop, determination replacing shock. We have to act. Bishop nodded. You need guidance from Civil Rights Council. There's a potential conflict of interest, but we can manage it. Lena stood. Get me Simone Rivers. We move fast. In that tense silence, Lena bundled legal papers in her arms. The boundary between her professional role and personal heartache blurred. Justice or kinship? Now the lines began to dissolve. The county courthouse hearing room, aglow with natural light from tall arched windows, was configured for decisive action. A long conference table commanded the room's center. Atop it lay meticulously organized legal pads, stacks of case files, microphones, and water carafes. On the left side, a diverse group of community leaders, civil rights advocates and representatives from victim support organizations had gathered. On the opposite side, Judge Lena Evans sat poised, with her assistant Bishop beside her. At the table's head stood attorney Simone Rivers, representing civil rights interests and bringing legal authority to the assembly. A profound stillness enveloped the room as Judge Evans rose, each movement measured and deliberate. No remarks were exchanged. The atmosphere reflected gravity and anticipation. Judge Evans began by affirming her commitment to transparency. She stated that her mother, Esther Evans, had been subjected to a violent assault recognized as a hate crime. Acknowledging the personal connection, Judge Evans announced her intention to withdraw from all judicial proceedings associated with the case. The judge's recusal followed established legal standards. She referenced Canon 2.11 of the American Bar Association's Model Code of Judicial Conduct, which mandates that judges must disqualify themselves if their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Page 2.11 clarifies that recusal is not restricted to actual bias. It extends to situations where even the appearance of bias exists. Additionally, Judge Evans cited 28 U.S.C.S. 455, the federal statute requiring judges to recuse themselves from any proceedings where their impartiality could reasonably be questioned. This section imposes a strict duty on judges to disqualify themselves on personal or relational grounds, including instances with familial ties to a participant in the case. Judge Evans's recusal was not a trivial gesture. It represented both compliance with legal obligation and a deliberate affirmation of judicial impartiality. By proactively recusing herself, not waiting for counsel or other parties to initiate motions, she ensured that the judicial proceedings would be free from any suspicion of favoritism or compromise. Following the recusal announcement, Judge Evans outlined the remainder of her role. Although stepping away from formal proceedings, she pledged to remain involved as a witness and legal advisor. She would collaborate with the prosecution, providing testimony, consulting on legal strategy, and ensuring that the case accurately reflected both the personal harm done and the broader implications of hate-motivated violence. By repositioning herself in this advisory capacity, she preserved her ability to influence the case substantively without exerting judicial authority. Attorney Simone Rivers then clarified the procedural plan designed to preserve both transparency and integrity. The prosecution would reassign the case to another judge to prevent any conflict of interest. Judge Evans's participation as an advisor would enhance credibility without crossing legal boundaries. Her public stance and moral commitment would strengthen the legitimacy of proceedings, particularly in cases with national attention. Community leaders reaffirmed their support, highlighting the symbolic impact of her stance. A judge standing aside from her case, yet providing support for justice. Questions about trial fairness were met with assurance. Judge Evans's recusal complied with federal law and judicial ethics. Her role would remain accountable and public, with verifiable documentation. A prosecutor confirmed that a substitute judge would be appointed immediately and that official filings would reflect the recusal. The Justice Voices studio was transformed into a command center of truth and resolve. Behind them, the backdrop bore the bold motto, "Truth and Justice," while a bank of cameras, high-definition screens, and studio lighting created an atmosphere of purpose. Technical staff monitored live chat metrics and calibrated feeds. At center stage sat Jamal, host and advocate, with Judge Lena Evans seated beside him, visible, empowered, unified. As the Go Live indicator blinked on, the broadcast surged forward. In the first few minutes, viewership climbed past 5,000, then to over 10,000, demonstrating public hunger for accountability. Lena appeared composed, dignified in a tailored blazer with a discreet ribbon bearing her mother's name, Esther. The sight of a black-sitting judge opening her voice on screen carried significant weight. Lena's message was resolute and unambiguous. Her mother, Esther Evans, had suffered a hate crime assault, brutally dragged through mud by a tractor because she is black. No mitigating circumstances, no neutral framing, just a factual declaration of hate-fueled violence. She then announced a community march on Saturday, July 19 at 10 a.m. to be held at the scene of the attack, the farm entrance. This was both ceremonial and confrontational, a public gathering to demand justice, visibility, and solidarity. Highlighting broader systemic failures, Jamal then contextualized the live stream with alarming data. According to a 2024 GAO report, hate crimes occur nearly every hour in the U.S., with online hate speech a contributing factor to violent behaviors, suggesting that virtual hatred often translates into physical harm. Lena's broadcast wasn't just about her mother's suffering, it was a rallying cry against a nationwide crisis. Lena then introduced an edited clip from the attack. Brief yet powerful, the camera panned across the tractor wheel grinding the cane, the mud-splattered ground, and Esther's visible struggle. Silence, for several seconds, allowed the gravity to settle. Lena offered no commentary, letting the clip stand as its indictment. She then reinforced the point. This was real, public, and undeniable evidence of hate-fueled violence. Within 3 hours, the live stream exceeded 50,000 views, circulated across platforms, and triggered the viral hashtag #JusticeForEsther. Thousands of comments poured in, expressing support, shock, and demands for accountability. Lena's voice resonated through it all. This isn't revenge, it's reclaiming justice. Our march is a statement that silence has boundaries. Jamal framed the broadcast within a national narrative. He cited academic research indicating that spikes in online hate speech often precede real-world hate crimes. Lena responded, "The march is more than a protest. It's counter-speech in action, an act meant to disrupt digital echo chambers and assert collective presence." By the end, the live stream offered tangible calls to action. Registration links for the march, comprehensive safety guidelines, and contact points. Lena also announced the formation of a justice fund, co-founded with attorney Simone Rivers, aimed at providing financial, legal, and emotional support to hate crime survivors. The evening before the scheduled community march saw Esther Evans's farmhouse transformed into a hub of purpose under a dim golden haze emitted by string lights and generator-powered lamps. In this quiet dusk, the gathering buzzed with resolve. Volunteers hovered over tables strewn with freshly printed "Justice for Esther" banners and placards, while others assembled sturdy foam board signs bearing messages like "Justice Now" and "No More Hate." A large inflatable arch, installed at the farm entrance, would mark the official starting line for the march. Amid the ambient hum of communal effort, every detail, papers, cables, microphones, was meticulously arranged, a testament to the determination driving this event. Nearby, a technical crew fine-tuned sound equipment, a mixer, amplified speakers, and microphones tested and rerouted for clarity. Jamal's media team integrated live stream connectivity to ensure a smooth broadcast the next morning. Just beyond the sound checks, organizers constructed a registration station, complete with sign-in sheets, QR-coded links to legal and mental health resources, and hubs stocked with bottled water, snacks, and basic medical supplies. Volunteers donned safety vests, coordinating logistics with quiet urgency and shared glances that spoke of the gravity they all felt. As night deepened, school-age locals began to arrive after finishing evening classes, painted faces expressing solidarity and handmade signs in hand. They joined elders and neighbors in forming small clusters of conversation around the farmhouse porch lights. Elders talked in hushed tones, recalling how secluded Esther had grown since her attack, how few had visited, and now how this collective push for justice symbolized both empathy and communal resilience. The farmhouse, once a site of violence, had become a gathering place for hope and purpose. Across the dusty driveway, a formation of local police officers stood under streetlights beyond the fencing. Among them, Officer Mason appeared, the same figure whose actions had set this sequence of events into motion. Now coordinating quietly with the police chief, Mason issued directives. Officers were to maintain a perimeter along the road, to pair up and stay alert, The chief reminded his team that body cameras must remain active and ordered a careful balance, firm presence, without escalation. Their posture radiated tension, an austere formality that underscored the seriousness of the march. In a nearby mobile command van, authorities monitored crowd maps, social media updates, and live-stream test feeds. In parallel, inside the farmhouse's makeshift operations center, Jamal and attorney Simone Rivers completed final preparations alongside the volunteer leadership team. They walked through the march route from the farmhouse entrance to the courthouse steps. Safety protocols were reviewed, hydraulic first aid kits accessible, phone meant hotlines staffed, legal observers briefed, roles were confirmed, lead marshals to guide the procession, de-escalation teams to defuse tense encounters with police if needed, and media liaisons to coordinate press presence and maintain message clarity. Social media had become the lifeline of tonight's prep. A dedicated hashtag campaign surged. Videos showing volunteer sign painting, arch inflation, and tech setup were posted live. By 10 p.m., RSVPs had spiked by 40%, energized by glimpses of solidarity in action. Strategy teams posted instructions: where to park, what to wear, what to bring, water, chargers, signs. Legal rights were clarified under the First Amendment, instructions extended for peaceful assembly, and helpline contacts shared. This synchrony of digital strategy and physical readiness reinforced one core message: participants were cared for and their voices mattered. Meanwhile, Simone organized a team of legal observers certified in protest documentation. Their role: record interactions, gather statements, and serve as neutral watchdogs protecting both public and law enforcement rights. They were equipped with clipboards, vests, and briefing materials. Additional instructions included a reminder to maintain visual and verbal transparency, avoid confrontation, and respect both protest guidelines and law enforcement boundaries. An acknowledgement that dignity extends to method as well as message. Despite the late hour and daunting stakes, the atmosphere was electric, with purpose rather than fatigue. Volunteers shared anecdotes of Esther's community presence, the way she welcomed visiting grandchildren, her care for her garden, incidents known to neighbors but amplified now in collective memory. This night of preparation felt like building a bridge between personal remembrance and public action, each plank laid with intention. As midnight approached, vehicle headlights glimmered on the driveway. Jamal strolled through care zones, adjusting camera angles and checking livestream feeds alongside the media tech crew. Plans were finalized, camera squads mapped across the route, livestream to begin at 9:50 a.m. beneath the inflatable arch. Meanwhile, traffic coordinators confirmed road closures with county dispatch. Law enforcement distributed maps detailing crowd movement corridors and precautionary zones. At the farmhouse gate, bright stencils on black fabric proclaimed in white letters, "March starts here, 10 a.m. Saturday, Justice for Esther." Nearby, a quiet exchange occurred between Mason and the police chief. "Officers on perimeter, cams running, use the least force. Understood." "We avoid confrontation unless provoked," replied the chief. The compact exchange echoed across the compound in subdued acknowledgement of fragile equilibrium. Social media buzz persisted. Volunteers recorded time-stamped clips of arch lighting, sign stacking, and evening patrol walks. The farmhouse, quiet yet electric, held the calm before a gathering storm of voices and slogans. Volunteers sorted through pre-packed backpacks, one for emergencies, another for celebratory essentials. Signs were color-coded by route section, water distributed in insulated coolers, and emergency radios tested for reach. Long after local residents had retreated into tents and cars for brief rest, rows of exhausted yet determined organizers paced the yard. They recited chants to practice cadence, fine-tuned calls for inclusivity among marchers, and adjusted safety grids for children and elderly participants. The farmhouse felt fortified with shared resolve. Every tree, every rod of tape anchored a promise. Just as first light tinted the horizon, the last steps of readiness fell into place. Volunteers swapped final reminders. Smile, stay focused, treat everyone with respect. The farmhouse gate stood open, the inflatable arch greeting the dawn. Amid the quiet aura of dawn's approach, a collective hush fell, a silent oath of accountability and unity. Everything was in position: the arch, the signs, the speakers, the plan, the people. Everything was ready. The next morning's march promised more than mere turnout. It held potential to redirect the narrative. This march could stand as a turning point, not only for Esther and her family, but for a community awakened to its voice. Dawn broke over Esther Evans's farm as a determined group of around 100 marchers approached the front gate. Leading the procession stood Judge Lena Evans, her posture unwavering and her gaze resolute. Accompanying her was Jamal, capturing every moment on camera. He gave up. Behind them moved students, villagers, civil rights advocates, and local news crews, each step echoing their shared purpose. As they neared the gate, the very sight of Esther's assault, the mood shifted. A line of armed police officers stood in stark formation, their uniforms and rigid stance transforming the tranquil farm entrance into a tension-fraught boundary. The scene crackled with anticipation. Peaceful protest poised against institutional authority. The march halted a few meters from the police line. Lena moved forward alone, raising a megaphone, her presence drawing murmured attention. Moments later, the crowd erupted in unified chants. "Justice for Esther! Justice for all!" Their voices shattered the morning's stillness, a defiant chorus demanding acknowledgement. A senior officer stepped forward, approaching Lena with measured caution. He spoke quietly but firmly, offering a compromise. The group could enter the premises under the condition of silence, no live streaming, and restricted access. It was a tactical proposal: allow them into the farm, but control their narrative. Lena paused, weighing the gesture. She then shook her head, silent and unwavering. She gestured for the march to continue. No hidden negotiations, no backstage agreements. The message was clear. Transparency and public solidarity would guide their path. The crowd surged forward, pressing gently past the now held-back police line. Banners waved high, voices still firm in their chants. As the procession crossed the threshold, the farmyard seemed to hold its breath, now reclaiming space for justice. They advanced to the site where Esther's cane had broken under that tractor's wheel. Lena led the group into a solemn moment of silence. No chanting, no noise, just a shared presence standing witness to injustice. The atmosphere was heavy with communal memory. Lena then spoke through the megaphone, her voice steady and clear. "We stand here for Esther. We stand here for dignity. We stand here to reject cowardice and hate. We will remain until justice is delivered." Her words anchored the crowd's conviction, transforming their gathering into a unified act of public testimony. People formed a wide circle around the broken ground. Hands joined in solidarity. Some wiped away tears, others held signs high or lowered their heads. The energy was quiet, yet powerful. A collective assertion that they would not be overlooked. Now gathered on the farmhouse steps, Lena's presence as a sitting judge front and center symbolically transformed the sight. She was no longer just a voice. She was embodying a judiciary deeply invested in equality. The police presence remained at the perimeter, but their barrier had been respectfully crossed. Channels of media broadcast the moment live. This was the public face of private violence, made visible for all to witness. For the first time, the community reclaimed the space, not merely as an emotional site, but as a stage for collective accountability. This was far more than a march, it was a symbolic breakthrough. A black judge led a peaceful crowd beyond a police blockade to stand where injustice had occurred. It was a moment where presence became protest and dignity confronted power. Morning sunlight trickled through gaps in the barn walls, casting dust-filmed beams across hay-strewn floors, and the makeshift podium where people stood. The barn, a quiet witness to past violence, now hosted an emergent wave of revelations. A crowd of town residents, legal observers, journalists, and activists formed a semicircle around Judge Lena Evans, standing with quiet strength. Nearby, Jamal fine-tuned camera angles, adjusting lights to capture each unfolding moment. Two figures emerged from the crowd: David Martinez, a farmhand in dusty overalls, and Angela Thompson, a local schoolteacher clutching her phone, a shaky but determined piece of evidence. The air hummed with anticipation as the community focused on their testimony. David stepped forward first, voice steady but edged with lingering fear. He recounted working alongside Mason earlier in the year, when a minor paperwork check evolved into an unprovoked confrontation. Mason cornered him by a tractor, shouting racial insults, accusing David of trespassing, and grabbed him by the collar, forcing him against the machinery. The words that followed echoed still. "Get out before I show you how fast you can vanish. In my county." David stood silent for a beat, then held out his phone for all to hear. The audio played, Mason's voice hissing hateful threats, calling David dirty, and assuring violence if he didn't leave. The crowd quaked. This wasn't just rumor or innuendo, it was recorded proof of intimidation. Next, Angela moved forward, voice unsteady as she spoke of a calmer but no less toxic incident. Months ago, while organizing a lesson in anti-racism at the barn, her path crossed Mason's. His words cut through her morning's hope. "Your kind's too sensitive. We don't let your people run off white folks here." She raised her shaky phone, playing the clip. Mason's tone was chillingly casual. No formal words, just blunt dismissal. "No one cares if you cry about it." Angela paused, tears in her eyes. Not of weakness, but outrage. "I came to teach tolerance," she said. "I encountered hatred." The barn reverberated with stunned silence. Justice, once personal to Lena, now revealed itself as part of a systemic pattern. She motioned to attorney Simone Rivers, who stepped forward and declared the unfolding cases would move beyond Esther: criminal charges for assault, threats and intimidation, civil suits for emotional harm and discrimination. She reminded the crowd that words left unexamined now faced scrutiny, and that both state and federal authorities would be compelled to act. Murmurs of approval rippled through the onlookers. Some wept quietly, others clasped hands. The barn, once a setting for everyday life, had transformed into a theater of moral reckoning. Lena addressed David and Angela directly. "Your courage reveals what we must face. This isn't just individual injustice, it's a call for broader healing." There were no cheers, only reflective affirmation. The moment felt profound, not performative, and it echoed far beyond the wooden walls. By stepping forward, David and Angela reframed the narrative. What appeared isolated, the attack on Esther, now emerged as symptomatic of a much wider pattern. The barn no longer held silence, it held testimony. One man's assault, another's verbal attack, all tied to the same source. Intimidation, threats, condescension, woven into a tapestry of prejudice and control. This was not a random act, it was a pattern. At Lena's signal, Jamal began streaming live across social media. His narration was calm but urgent. Esther's case opened the door. Today, David and Angela walk through it, carrying allegations and evidence that reveal a broader web of discrimination. This is not isolated. It is systemic. If you believe in justice, elves stand with them. Cameras captured faces. Grief mingled with resolve. The images spread, shared and retweeted. The hashtag Justice for All began trending alongside Justice for Esther. Viewers from outside the country tuned in, drawn to the unfolding reality of collective testimony. Comments poured in. No longer alone. This is standing up. They took their fear and made it a public stand. Network news outlets began to share the stream. Editors reached out for interviews. Civil rights advocates commended the demonstration of legal transparency and community courage. The barn, once a site of hidden power, became a beacon of public voice. As the live stream ended, Lena and Simone convened behind the podium. Their agenda was now multi-pronged. Criminal indictments finalized with audio and video evidence, civil suits drafted with legal support, broader coalitions mobilizing for witnesses and solidarity, press kits prepared to ensure accurate, impactful coverage. Jamal scheduled follow-up segments, interviews with David and Angela, expert analyses of hate crime law, and segments on community rights. Graphic designers created posters, "You are not alone, justice for all." Courage, once cornered, had become contagious. By midweek, the Justice for Esther campaign erupted online, igniting social media platforms across the nation. Jamal's originally local live stream morphed into blazing digital content. Clips circulated on Twitter, Instagram Reels compiled protest moments, and TikTok creators reshared snapshots of banners and chants. Within hours, the total combined views surged into the hundreds of thousands, making the farm protest a trending phenomenon. The hashtag Justice for Esther populated profile photos, comment threads, and news feeds from coast to coast. One clip, depicting Lena's firm refusal to retreat at the farm gate, went viral. Commenters wrote, "This is what justice looks like," and "Watching a judge lead her community, powerful." In virtual solidarity events, users posted photos of themselves wearing handmade signs or sharing the barn scene with emotional captions. Every share, like, and download reinforced the movement's momentum. Integration into mainstream media happened swiftly. Within a day, cable news programming, anchored by CNN, ABC, and NPR, ran segments featuring protest highlights, community impact, and legal context. Evening news bulletins opened with Lena's face, juxtaposed against the raw images from the protest barn, praised as a rural ripple with national resonance. Media outlets quickly connected Esther's story to broader trends. According to the FBI's 2023 hate crime statistics, reported incidents reached 11,862, a slight increase from the 11,634 cases in 2022, a new high point after years of consistent rises. Race-based hate crimes accounted for 5,900 of those incidents, with over 51.3% targeting Black victims. Context, which transformed the local story into one emblematic of systemic racial violence. National news emphasized that violent crime overall was on a downward trajectory in 2023. Violent offenses fell by 3%, murder down by 11.6%, rape down 9.4%. Yet, despite the broader crime reduction, hate crimes continued to climb, signaling what one analyst termed a moment of national dissonance. In the 10 largest U.S. cities, reported hate crimes spiked by double-digit percentages, averaging an 11% increase in 2023 alone. This stark contradiction intensified the sense that Esther's case was part of a broader crisis. Over the next 48 hours, commentators across CNN and public radio described the story as "rural America's reckoning" and "a moment of moral clarity" in video footage. Civil rights leaders, historians, and policy experts engaged in interview segments. Drawing parallels between this protest and historic moments, Emmett Till, the Freedom Rides, and modern hate crime surges, scholars emphasize that national data reveal how anti-black hate dramatically outpaces other biases. A civil rights attorney on NPR called this movement a digital bridge between accountability and action, citing the audio-visual layers, Esther's trauma, Lena's leadership, David's and Angela's testimonies, as an unusual combination of emotional and evidentiary weight. Inside what had become a temporary press tent near the farmhouse, attorney Simone Rivers convened her legal team. The public momentum was now too substantial for the local prosecutor to ignore. Evidence gathering shifted into high gear, verified copies of Mason's threats, affidavits from David, Angela, and Esther, and a digital library of the live-stream footage. Simone mapped out a timeline, criminal charges to be filed by the end of the week, a civil complaint detailing emotional injuries and racial harassment to follow, requests for hate crime enhancement under state and federal law. She also worked on motions to seal critical audio and video evidence, balancing judicial transparency with strategic protection ahead of trial. Meanwhile, Jamal orchestrated an escalating media strategy. Live follow-up interviews were scheduled. Esther, Lena, David, Angela, all local voices, now national figures. The barn and farmhouse entrance were scripted as satellite news centers, complete with anchor backgrounds reading "Justice for Esther," echoing the earlier barn footage in renewed context. Jamal's next live stream scheduled a roundtable panel featuring analysts and intellectuals labeled "Justice and Data: America's Hate Crisis." The team also produced visual canvases, statistical overlays of hate crime trends. 11,862 incidents in 2023, 51% anti-black, superimposed on Esther's fields in stylized posts across Instagram and Twitter. Support cascaded outward. Rallies were organized in major cities, with signs citing Esther's fields and Lena's statement. University campuses held teach-ins on hate crime law. Nonprofits coalesced around Justice for All, expanding the message beyond one story to include systemic accountability and criminal justice reform. A GoFundMe campaign for victims' legal and medical expenses dwarfed its goal in hours. Volunteer networks formed to support protest participants in physical and digital security. Read receipts reached the local and state police. Mason and law enforcement administration realized the stakes. What began as a disciplinary matter was now a national legal and moral flashpoint. Internal memos, later leaked, outlined damage control strategies, professional statements, monitored social media, delayed interviews, and invitations for external review by state investigative units. The sheriff's office announced cooperating with state prosecutors. Mason's lawyers began assembling defense strategies. The narrative had shifted, no longer a local incident, but headline controversy. Cross-media ecosystems, Justice for Esther, morphed into a rallying cry, Justice for All. A graphic depicting tractor tracks across farmland, overlaid on hate crime numbers, circulated thousands of times. A Twitter thread dissected hate crime stats alongside protest photos, with replies like, "This is the moment," and "We're watching." A digital petition for hate crimes reform surpassed 250,000 signatures. News organizations, Senate offices, NGOs, and think tanks spun up inquiry. Congressional staffers reportedly began drafting policy memes referencing the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act and broader hate crime enhancements. While some initiatives were nascent, the tide had shifted. From a rural injustice to nationwide outrage, Justice for Esther crystallizes a broken national backdrop. 11,862 hate incidents in 2023, 2% increase. Racially motivated over half the cases, particularly anti-black. This is more than a protest. It's a movement against structural bigotry. Night had long fallen by the time attorney Simone Rivers and her legal team gathered in their makeshift war room, a cramped office above the old Main Street bakery, now stacked floor to ceiling with evidence boxes, legal pads, and hard drives humming with archived news clippings and depositions. The low drone of the copy machine and the blue glow of laptop screens lit the room, as if the quiet town itself was finally holding its breath. At the heart of it all, Simone leafed through folders so thick their fasteners had begun to split. Every page was a story, every form a breadcrumb on the trail of a single man's history, a history that, until now, had survived in whispers and shadow. But tonight, for the first time, Mason's legacy would be forced into the open. Her paralegal, Marcus, spread another folder across the table. "You need to see this," he said quietly. The pages he revealed were brittle at the edges, records older than Marcus himself, some photocopied so many times the ink had faded to a ghostly gray. Yet the words were unmistakable. Witness statements, incident reports, complaints with Mason's name typed in blocky all-caps. Simone's eyes narrowed as she scanned the list. Here was the pattern no one had ever assembled. Mason's record was more than the sum of recent headlines. It was a decades-long trail of violence, intimidation, and, most damning of all, institutional neglect. The earliest file was dated nearly 20 years ago. The handwriting was shaky, but the narrative was clear. A black farmer, Walter Green, alleged that Mason, then a rookie patrolman, had used his position to force Walter off his land. The pretense was a property dispute, but the farmer's words cut through the legal jargon. "He called me boy and told me, 'Black folks don't own this earth.'" There was a notation in the margin: "No action, lack of evidence." Walter's farm was later sold at auction, the circumstances murky and unexplained. As Simone and Marcus continued, each file told a similar story. In 2008, a complaint from a single mother named Cynthia Harris. She described Mason banging on her door, brandishing a service weapon, and demanding to see lease papers. When she protested, Mason threatened to arrest her for trespass on her property. A neighbor corroborated Cynthia's statement, but when the file reached internal affairs, a single line concluded the inquiry: unsubstantiated. Officer's word prevails. The deeper Simone dug, the more the stories repeated. Some victims had been too frightened to even sign their names. One man, listed as James E., described being stopped at a rural intersection and ordered out of his pickup. Mason demanded to search the truck. James complied, only to be berated. "Go back to where you belong." James later left the county. The incident never discussed again, until now. Every case, it seemed, shared the same outcome. No formal charges, no disciplinary action. When pressed for more, Marcus shook his head. "It's like the entire system was designed to forget," he muttered. Simone agreed. Each decision to shelve a case, each missing piece of evidence, each unsigned or retracted witness statement was part of something larger than simple neglect. It was a pattern, a shadow system operating in plain sight. At midnight, Simone turned to the thickest file of all, a 2016 property seizure in which Mason had used his badge to orchestrate the forced eviction of a black family. The family, the Sullivans, had lived on the land for 3 generations. The complaint was detailed and painful. Mason arrived with a county land agent and 4 deputies. He waved a warrant in their faces, later discovered to be incomplete, and ordered them out by sunrise or else. The Sullivans left. By the time they returned to contest the eviction, the house had been bulldozed and their belongings destroyed. The Sullivans had tried to fight back. Letters to the sheriff, petitions to the county board. The sheriff's response: no wrongdoing found. Procedures followed. But tucked in the back of the file, Simone found a Polaroid snapshot hidden in a sheaf of unrelated forms. The photo showed Mason smiling in front of the bulldozer, his hand on the lever. On the back, in faded pencil, were the words, "Told you we run things here." Simone stared at the picture for a long time. The evidence was circumstantial, yes, but the intent was unmistakable. Mason's abuses weren't accidents or one-off fits of anger. They were part of a worldview, a methodical campaign of exclusion, humiliation, and property theft, made possible by a system that preferred silence to scandal. Marcus, combing through an old newspaper archive, found more pieces to the puzzle. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud from a yellowed newsprint. Community activist group alleges racial bias in county land seizures. Nature Mason, Deputy Mason is repeat offender. Simone listened closely. The article described a protest staged at the courthouse steps in 2017, led by a reverend who had since moved away. The protest fizzled quickly. The group was met by counter-protesters, and after a few days the story vanished from the press. Together they traced more recent digital breadcrumbs, forum threads, old Facebook groups, grainy cell phone footage. One post recounted a 2021 incident. A black teenager pulled over for loitering in a parking lot, only to be shoved to the ground by Mason and handcuffed. The mother's Facebook plea for accountability had gained a few dozen shares before disappearing in the churn of social outrage. By 2 a.m., the office floor was littered with files, newsprint, and crumpled sticky notes, each containing fragments of the truth. Simone arranged them chronologically, pinning each case to a corkboard. The narrative took shape before their eyes, a grim mosaic of intimidation and erasure, made possible not only by Mason's actions, but by a culture of complicity. Marcus, exhausted, sat back. No wonder no one stopped him. They never even tried. Simone nodded. "This isn't just about Mason," she replied. "It's about the entire system that let him keep going. If we don't bring this history into court, nothing will change." They spent the next hours preparing a summary memo, a timeline of Mason's incidents, a cross-referenced list of witnesses and complainants, and a preliminary brief for the prosecutor. For the first time, the story of Mason's misconduct would not be told in isolation, but as a pattern, one piece of a larger, unbroken chain. As dawn broke, Simone and Marcus pored over the files once more. They called the prosecutor's office to request subpoena power for additional records, internal memos, disciplinary reviews, and personnel files. The goal was clear: to prove not just that Mason had abused his power, but that he had done so systematically, and with the tacit approval, or at least indifference of those meant to hold him accountable. In the hours that followed, Simone drafted motions to admit the historical evidence as part of the current case. She wrote to the county board demanding a full review of Mason's tenure and prepared a press statement, carefully worded, but unflinching in its demands for transparency. Throughout the morning, more people came forward. Anonymous tips flooded in. Former county employees, a retired sheriff's deputy, even the grown children of families Mason had displaced. Each account painted the same picture. Mason used his uniform as a tool of intimidation, targeting those least able to defend themselves, confident that no one would stand up to him. As the legal team's narrative grew stronger, the stakes climbed. News of the investigation spread. Reporters began sniffing around the courthouse, asking for interviews. Civil rights organizations offered pro bono support and expert witnesses. The momentum became impossible to ignore. Simone felt the weight of history. She knew that the case was no longer about a single incident, nor even a single victim. It was about the cumulative cost of a culture that had permitted violence and discrimination to flourish, unchecked and unremarked. In the files stacked around her, she saw not just Mason's legacy, but the pain of an entire community, one that had been silenced for too long. That evening, as the sun set over Main Street, Simone gathered her team for a final briefing. They would assemble a comprehensive historical supplement for the case. Every affidavit, every dismissed complaint, every photo and audio clip. The evidence would tell a story larger than Mason himself. A story of opportunity stolen, dignity denied, and a county's willful blind. The office was quiet as Simone penned the closing lines of their summary. Mason's conduct is not an aberration, but a consequence of unchecked power. Justice demands not just redress for today's victims, but acknowledgement of all who have been harmed. With the files ready and the team assembled, they prepared for the next phase, taking Mason's history of abuse, piece by piece, into the courtroom. The battle ahead would be fierce, but for the first time they had more than rumors. They had the past, in black and white, and a mandate to make it matter. This was not just a pattern, it was a system, a chain of abuses stretching back decades, finally being brought to light. The morning after the legal team's discoveries, the Evans farm gate became a scene of swirling tension and anticipation. National media trucks lined the country road, their satellite dishes spinning to catch a signal. Cameramen and journalists huddled in small clusters, swapping rumors, warming their hands with takeout coffee. Some had been there since dawn, knowing that the Mason case, once a local headline, was now captivating a nation. It was against this backdrop of urgency and scrutiny that Linda Mason appeared, quietly at first, almost hesitant. She wore an old blue coat, her hair loosely pinned back, her face marked by exhaustion and resolve. At first, only a handful of journalists noticed her as she stepped onto the gravel shoulder beyond the farm's battered gate. Someone recognized her. A whisper moved through the crowd. The hush spread quickly. Mason's wife was here. The focus of 100 lenses shifted, and the crowd pressed forward, forming a loose semicircle around the solitary figure. Linda paused, eyes flickering across the unfamiliar faces, then braced herself. She had not planned to speak. For days she had tried to block out the news, tried to reconcile the man she had married with the headlines describing him as a symbol of hate and violence. But the night before, after yet another story about Mason's abuses flashed across the television, she lay awake until sunrise. She could not carry her silence any longer. When the first reporter called out, "Mrs. Mason, do you have a statement?" Linda hesitated. She had rehearsed this moment in her head many times, yet nothing seemed adequate now that she stood at its center. The microphones thrust forward, the red camera lights blinked, and Linda's hands shook as she gathered her courage. She began quietly, barely above the wind that rattled the hedges. She told the press that for years she had witnessed her husband speak of black families and workers with contempt. He had used slurs at their kitchen table, muttered curses as he returned home late from the farm, and boasted about showing them their place. Each time, Linda recalled, her heart would clench in shame and fear. She pleaded with him to stop, reminding him that their children were growing up in a world that demanded better from its men. But Mason only grew more irritable, more dangerous. Linda's voice wavered, but she pressed on. She revealed that she had endured Mason's temper herself, far from the eyes of the public or the badge he wore at work. Twice, she said, she had been hospitalized after confrontations at home. Once, with 3 broken ribs. Another time, with a concussion. Each time, she told emergency room doctors, she had fallen on the stairs or slipped in the bathtub, afraid of what Mason would do if anyone learned the truth. "He always found a way to make me feel it was my fault," Linda said, her voice cracking. "But I can't let him do that to anyone else. Not anymore." The journalists, at first intent on their notes, now watched Linda in stunned silence. Her confession was both damning and raw. She described the confusion and self-doubt that come from living in the shadow of violence. how Mason controlled every aspect of their life together, even deciding who she could speak with in town. Linda explained how she came to understand that Mason's racism wasn't something he reserved for work or strangers. It infected their home, their marriage, and ultimately her sense of safety. As Linda spoke, the cameras captured every nuance, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she clenched her fists to keep from trembling, the pale scars just visible beneath the cuffs of her coat. She didn't ask for pity, she demanded truth. "For too long I tried to protect him," she said, "even from himself. But the truth is, he is responsible for his choices, and so am I, for not coming forward sooner." She paused, glancing toward the farm fields, where she'd once dreamed of raising a family far from the violence and noise of her childhood. Instead, she'd found herself trapped in a home defined by fear and secrets. The reporters gave her space, sensing the weight of her words. Linda told them about the moments that haunted her most, the late nights when Mason would come home angry, the way he would sneer about those people at the farm, his pride in humiliating black neighbors who dared to stand up for themselves. She remembered the first time she witnessed him shove a black teenager at a grocery store parking lot. She wanted to intervene, but Mason glared at her, and she felt her courage vanish. Her confession was more than a revelation about Mason. It was a window into the way racism and violence intertwine and fester in private. Linda admitted she had stayed silent out of fear, but also out of a misguided hope that Mason might change if she loved him enough, if she just waited. In reality, her silence had become a prison for them both. As she recounted her memories, the crowd of journalists and bystanders grew stiller. A few reporters looked away, shaken by the rawness of her story. Some whispered among themselves, realizing the significance of her testimony. Mason's wife, the person who knew him best, was now the one pulling down the last defense he had. There was no longer any question about his character. Her words shattered his facade. Linda then took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I'm not proud of being silent. I know others have suffered because I didn't say anything sooner, but I'm here now. If anyone else is afraid, I want them to know that you can come forward. You're not alone. You don't have to let fear win." As the wind picked up, Linda shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. She looked directly into one of the cameras. "To the people Mason hurt and to their families, I am so sorry. I hope my truth will help bring some justice and maybe some peace." She refused to take questions. As the press surged forward, Linda turned away, making her way through the crowd with a steadiness that had eluded her for years. The reporters shouted after her, but she didn't look back. In that moment, her testimony traveled farther than the edges of the farm. Attorney Simone Rivers watched the live stream replay with her team. They were silent as Linda's face flickered on the screen. Simone recognized the power of Linda's confession. Here was someone whose testimony could not be discredited as hearsay or prejudice. Linda had nothing to gain and everything to lose, yet she spoke anyway. Her statement would not only bolster the case against Mason, but would also force the court and the public to confront the full scope of his cruelty, both public and private. Simone immediately instructed her staff to prepare a subpoena for Linda Mason. They began drafting a witness list that placed Linda's name near the top, alongside Esther, David, Angela, and the other victims. The narrative had changed. What was once the story of a single man's abuse of power was now clearly a pattern, a pathology of hatred and violence that reached from public policy into the most intimate corners of his life. Meanwhile, news of Linda's statement swept across social media and television. Clips of her confession led the evening news, with anchors describing her as the unexpected voice that finally shattered Mason's shield of denial. Online, viewers debated the implications, some expressing sorrow for Linda, others outrage that she had waited so long. But most agreed that her courage marked a turning point. A trending hashtag, Speak Out for Justice, emerged, encouraging others trapped in silence to come forward with their truths. Within hours, calls poured into Simone's office from other women, some who had known Mason, others who simply recognized themselves in Linda's story. A small support group formed, offering testimony and solidarity to those ready to step out of the shadows. The case, once about a single man's crimes, had grown into a reckoning for an entire community's silence. For Linda, the aftermath was both terrifying and liberating. She returned home to find police cars parked at the edge of her street, press again waiting for a statement, neighbors peering from behind curtains. But she stood taller, no longer afraid of Mason's wrath or her regret. She called her children and told them what she had done, unsure of how they would respond, but confident in her decision. In the days that followed, Simone's legal team worked tirelessly to ensure Linda's safety. They arranged for her to meet with trauma counselors, coordinated safe housing, and prepared her for the possibility of facing Mason in court. Linda agreed to testify, determined to use her pain to prevent further harm. The upcoming trial would be unlike any the county had seen. With Linda's testimony, the legal case gained a dimension it had previously lacked: irrefutable proof, from the heart of Mason's home, that his violence was not confined to strangers or adversaries, but extended to those closest to him. The prosecution's strategy shifted, centering Linda's story as a crucial link in the chain of evidence. Her suffering and her willingness to confront it had become an indispensable force in the pursuit of justice. In the final hours before her scheduled court appearance, Linda reflected on her journey. She wrote in her journal, "For years, I thought surviving was enough. Now I see that speaking is surviving, too." She closed her eyes, ready to face the world and her husband in the full light of truth. For the first time, the person who knew Mason best shattered the silence from within his own home, exposing the depth and reach of his cruelty. The courthouse stood solemn against the late afternoon sky, its classical columns and weathered brick illuminated by a wash of golden sunlight. This building, long a silent witness to the ordinary grind of civil disputes and routine arraignments, was now the epicenter of a historic reckoning. Word had spread swiftly that this day would mark a turning point, a day when the law, so often used to protect the powerful, would finally confront one of its own. Inside, tension pulsed through the marbled corridors. Reporters clustered in the vestibule, their notebooks poised, cameras at the ready, their whispered speculation carrying just above the low hum of courthouse routine. On the second floor, the district attorney's office had become a hive of controlled chaos. Files were stacked high, evidence tags poked from folders, and legal clerks hurried from desk to desk with urgent updates. It was here, behind a heavy oak door, that the fateful document awaited a signature that would set the justice system into irreversible motion. Seated at the end of the long conference table, Lena Evans inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She wore the black suit she reserved for serious court days, but there was an added gravity to her posture, a blend of sorrow, anger, and a rare, resolute hope. Just a month ago, her world had been confined to the routine complexities of her bench. Now she was at the center of a storm that reached far beyond her own life. The memory of her mother's pain, the faces of Angela and David, Linda Mason's trembling voice, all these swirled in her mind. Every signature today would carry the weight of their suffering. The county's chief prosecutor, Mark Dorsey, sat beside Lena, reviewing the final pages. His hair was more gray than black, his eyes tired but burning with determination. He'd spent his career prosecuting the predictable crimes of a small town: petty theft, domestic disputes, the occasional drug bust. This case was different. The evidence arrayed before him was unprecedented. Multiple victims, years of suppressed complaints, the testimony of Mason's wife, and a community finally willing to speak up. The stakes were not only legal, but deeply moral. Across the table, Police Chief Jordan Bell waited in silence, his uniform pressed, his face drawn and solemn. He had not slept much in the days leading up to this meeting. There was shame in his eyes, shame that he had not seen, or perhaps not wanted to see, what was happening within his ranks. But there was also relief, a sense that something broken was at last being confronted. His department's reputation was on the line, as was his legacy. The document at the center of the table was thick, its cover stamped State of Annual v. Mason in bold black letters. The first page listed the charges: aggravated hate crime, assault on a disabled person, battery, intimidation, obstruction of justice, and official misconduct. Behind it were affidavits, hospital reports, sworn statements, photographs, audio recordings, and digital evidence. There were the bruises on Esther's arms, and the audio of Mason's threats, but also the quieter testimonies: property seized, families driven out, countless slurs and threats recorded by victims who had finally found the courage to speak. Lena took up the pen and began to sign, her name forming in practiced strokes. It was a simple act, yet as she pressed the ink into paper, she felt the gravity of generations behind her, the ancestors who had labored in silence, who had survived on the margins, whose dignity had so often been denied by the very system she now served. Each signature was a promise that the pain and courage of those who had come forward would not be in vain. Dorsey countersigned, then slid the document to Chief Bell. The chief signed with a shaking hand, then removed his glasses, pressing his fingers to his eyes. He would be the one to notify Mason's department. There could be no more delays, no more excuses. At that moment, the prosecutor's assistant entered, carrying a stack of official forms and a heavy, rubber-handled stamp. She handed Lena the final page, the formal indictment order. Lena glanced at the text, then signed again, her hand steady, her gaze unflinching. Dorsey picked up the stamp and brought it down with a resonant thud. The sound echoed in the silent room, a bell tolling the beginning of justice in earnest. Downstairs, word spread quickly. One of the clerks stepped into the hallway, quietly sharing the news with a waiting reporter. In minutes, the press outside the courthouse was buzzing. Camera crews jostled for position, local radio hosts began their breaking news segments, and social media flashed with the update: Officer Mason indicted on multiple felonies, hate crime charges included. Back in the office, Lena stood, smoothing her suit. She glanced once more at the files, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and trepidation. "You did the right thing," Dorsey said quietly. But Lena barely heard him. Her mind was on the next steps, protecting the victims, preparing for trial, ensuring no detail could be swept aside by technicalities or intimidation. Chief Bell excused himself, phone already to his ear. Within half an hour, Mason was officially suspended from the police force. His badge and service weapons surrendered to the station desk. The news was delivered without ceremony. Mason's desk was cleared by a colleague, a man who had known him for 15 years, but who now avoided eye contact as he slid the badge into an envelope. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Lena was met by a wave of questions as she descended the steps. "Judge Evans, how do you feel? What message does this send to the community? Can the justice system finally restore trust after so much pain?" Lena stopped and faced the microphones, her voice calm but resonant. "Today, the law has spoken. No one is above it, not even those sworn to uphold it. This case is not about vengeance, but about dignity, accountability, and hope for every person who has ever doubted that justice can be done." She declined further questions and moved through the crowd, her expression unreadable. Inside the prosecutor's office, preparations for the preliminary hearing began immediately. Simone Rivers and her team submitted requests for protective orders for witnesses. They compiled the case file, double-checking every affidavit and chain of custody. The legal machinery, so long paralyzed by fear and inertia, was suddenly in relentless motion. That evening, as dusk fell over the courthouse and the press continued to gather outside, Lena sat in her office, reviewing the faces of those who had testified: Esther, Linda, David, Angela, and others. She thought of the cost of silence, of all the lives quietly broken over the years. Now, at last, the story was being told, not just in news headlines or in whispers, but in the official language of the law. The indictment changed everything. In police precincts, officers quietly asked themselves whether they too had once looked away. In town, neighbors debated the meaning of the charges, some angry, some relieved, many simply stunned. For Esther, watching from her hospital bed, tears ran silently down her cheeks. For Linda Mason, the pain of truth was tempered by the knowledge that she had not spoken in vain. For the first time, the machinery of justice moved not with sympathy alone, but with the authority of law, driven by the courage of the very people who had once been silenced. The courthouse, usually a quiet, functional building in the heart of town, buzzed with anxious energy. Its smallest courtroom, normally reserved for routine disputes, was suddenly at the center of a national conversation. The benches were packed. On one side, journalists with notepads and camera crews stationed by the doors. On the other, townspeople and supporters of the victims. In the middle rows, witnesses waited in silence, hands clasped tightly, the weight of history settling across their shoulders. Mason sat at the defendant's table, his uniform gone, replaced by a dark suit and the rigid mask of a man determined not to show fear. His lawyer, sharp-eyed and impeccably dressed, whispered strategies and reminders. Across the aisle, Lena sat among the witnesses, her presence both an anchor and a symbol. The victims, Esther, David, Angela, and others, sat nearby, hearts pounding, as the proceedings began. At the front of the room, the prosecutor rose to outline the state's case. Methodically, he presented the evidence. First, the video of Mason's attack on Esther was played on a large screen. Gasps and tears swept through the courtroom as the violence was laid bare for all to see. Esther looked down, hands trembling, but did not turn away. Next, the prosecutor called the other victims to the stand, one by one. David recounted the threats and humiliation he endured. Angela spoke of Mason's demeaning words and the fear she carried long after her encounter with him. Their testimony was unwavering, bolstered by audio recordings and written statements collected by the legal team. Mason's lawyer objected, questioned, and tried to poke holes in their stories, but the evidence was overwhelming. Each detail, each voice, added to the picture of systematic abuse. Mason himself was called to speak. He stood, voice cold, and denied every allegation. He claimed the videos were taken out of context, that the victims were confused or mistaken, and that he had never harbored ill intent. But the prosecutor countered with hard facts and corroboration. He reminded the court of Mason's long record of complaints and presented the historical files that had once been buried, cases of property seizures, threats, and violence that had left a trail of pain across the county. Every new piece of evidence stripped away another layer of Mason's defense. Throughout the hearing, the public's attention was intense. Journalists scribbled every word, broadcasting the day's events to a country that now saw this small courtroom as the site of a larger struggle for justice. At the close of the hearing, the prosecutor called for supplemental testimony. Linda Mason, Mason's wife, was summoned to the stand. The courtroom held its breath as she walked forward, her hands steady but her voice raw with emotion. She recounted the private side of Mason's violence and bigotry, how she had been threatened, how she had tried to stop him, how shame had kept her silent for too long. When she finished, there was a hush as Lena stood, meeting Linda's eyes across the room. With quiet strength, Lena nodded and offered her heartfelt thanks, publicly and without reservation, for Linda's courage in coming forward. It was a moment of solidarity that transcended the usual adversarial tone of the courtroom. The judge ordered a short recess, but the impact of the morning's testimony was clear. The town, and indeed the nation, had witnessed a reckoning that was both intensely personal and profoundly public. The preliminary hearing had not decided Mason's fate, but it had laid bare the truth, no longer hidden in rumor, no longer dismissed as exaggeration. For the first time, all sides confronted one another in open court, victims and abusers, law and memory, courage and denial. The fight for justice had moved from the shadows into the brightest possible light. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open with a measured creak as Linda Mason was escorted into the courtroom. Her footsteps echoed faintly on the polished marble floor, each step a quiet testament to the courage she had summoned. The murmurs of the crowd hushed as the gallery absorbed the gravity of the moment. The wife of the accused, once silent, was now called to expose the hidden truth. The jurors shifted in their seats, a mix of anticipation and unease flickering across their faces. The atmosphere was electric, yet somber, a collective awareness that the trial had reached a turning point. The room felt smaller, charged with the raw energy of impending revelation. Linda paused briefly at the witness stand. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as the bailiff administered the oath. Eyes scanning the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of Mason seated with his defense attorney. His expression was cold, unreadable, perhaps masking a flicker of apprehension. Taking a deep breath, Linda began. Her voice was soft but steady, each word carefully chosen, each sentence a piece of a painful puzzle slowly falling into place. She spoke first of the words, the countless moments where her husband's venomous tongue betrayed the man beneath the badge. She described evenings at the farm when Mason would return home, his demeanor darkened by resentment and prejudice. Around the dinner table, she recalled, he muttered slurs, derogatory epithets, directed at the black workers and neighbors he regularly encountered. Linda described how Mason referred to them as less than, troublemakers, and worse, with words so cruel they made her stomach twist. She told how she begged him to stop, to reconsider the bitterness that poisoned his soul, but he only laughed, brushing aside her pleas. "It's just how things are," she quoted him saying. "People like that don't deserve better." Her voice faltered briefly as she recounted an incident during a family barbecue, when Mason openly mocked a black employee in front of everyone. After several press conferences, Mason went further, declaring openly his right, humiliating the man with cruel jokes and veiled threats. Linda remembered the stunned silence that followed, the invisible line of shame that no one dared to cross or challenge. She admitted she had wanted to leave that moment, but she stayed, trapped in loyalty and fear. But the words were only part of the story. Linda's testimony shifted to the violence, both physical and emotional, that had marked her marriage for years. She recalled nights when Mason's anger erupted, not in words, but in blows. She spoke of the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the fractured ribs sustained in a moment of rage, the concussion that left her disoriented and afraid. Each injury was a betrayal of the vows they had taken, a manifestation of the hatred she had seen in him for so long. Her tears welled as she described how she had covered up the injuries, telling doctors fabricated stories of accidental falls, afraid that revealing the truth would bring more harm. "I was afraid of him," she confessed quietly, "but I was also afraid of what would happen if the truth came out." The courtroom was silent, every listener drawn into the web of pain Linda laid bare. Her testimony humanized the cruelty, not an abstract accusation, but the lived reality of a woman struggling to survive the man she once loved. Despite efforts by the defense to discredit her, Questioning the consistency of her memories, suggesting motives of revenge or malice, Linda's candor and emotional honesty shone through. Her detailed recollections, supported by medical records and photographs of her injuries, created an unassailable foundation. The prosecutor skillfully guided Linda through her testimony, highlighting key moments without overwhelming her. Each question elicited stories that reinforced the narrative of a man consumed by hatred and capable of violence in every facet of his life. At one point, Linda described a confrontation where she had attempted to intervene during one of Mason's public outbursts against black workers on the farm. She recalled how Mason's fury turned on her, his words laced with venom as he warned her to know her place. The humiliation and fear of that moment crystallized the toxic environment she endured. The judge watched silently, her expression grave but encouraging. Lena, seated just a few rows behind Linda, felt a surge of admiration. Her mother's pain was reflected in Linda's voice, and the courage it took to expose a man who had dominated her world. As Linda concluded, she issued a plea to the jury and the public that no one should be silenced by fear or shame, and that justice required the truth, however painful. "I want to protect those who cannot speak," she said, her voice strong despite the tears. "If my story can do that, then it's worth everything." The courtroom remained quiet for a moment, the weight of her words settling over all present. The defense attorney rose for his cross-examination, but even his sharp questioning could not undo the impact of Linda's testimony. She answered with calm resilience, her honesty piercing through every attempt to sow doubt. When the court recessed, murmurs filled the hallway. Reporters whispered of the unexpected turn. The wife's testimony had turned the tide, adding intimate detail that no video or third-party witness could match. Community members outside the courthouse spoke of Linda's bravery, many moved by the depth of pain she had borne in silence. For Linda, the experience was exhausting but empowering. The legal team arranged for counseling and security measures, aware of the emotional toll and potential backlash. Her role in the trial became pivotal, her words a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. In the days that followed, the narrative shifted publicly. News outlets hailed Linda's testimony as a breakthrough, emphasizing how her account revealed the full scope of Mason's violence and prejudice. Social media buzzed with support, and the hashtag #SpeakOutForJustice gained new traction as others were encouraged to share their experiences. For Lena, the testimony reinforced the purpose behind her pursuit of justice. It was no longer a personal fight, it was a communal imperative. Linda's courage had illuminated the shadows, and the legal battle had become a symbol of accountability and hope. Linda Mason's testimony laid bare the private horrors behind Mason's public persona, transforming the trial into a reckoning not just of actions, but of a lifetime of unchecked hate. The courtroom settled into a hushed expectancy as Mason was called to the stand. This was the moment many had been waiting for, the accused officer's opportunity to face the allegations, to speak in his voice after days of testimony from victims, witnesses, and his wife. His entrance was deliberate, measured, a man aware of the stakes, but confident in the defense carefully crafted for him. He wore a charcoal suit that seemed almost too stiff, a polished veneer to mask the turmoil underneath. His eyes swept across the jury, each face absorbing the gravity of his presence. The packed courtroom held its collective breath. Mason's defense attorney, a seasoned litigator with a calm demeanor and razor-sharp precision, began the questioning with deliberate care. Their strategy was clear from the outset: to recast Mason's actions not as hate-fueled aggression, but as the fulfillment of a difficult and often thankless job. Every confrontation, every harsh word, every physical move was to be framed within the context of law enforcement, a necessary means to maintain order and safety. Mason spoke in a measured, controlled tone, narrating a version of events that often stood in stark contrast to the graphic, visceral images and testimonies presented by the prosecution. He insisted that his actions were all conducted in the course of his duties, that he had never intended to cause harm, and that the events had been misrepresented by selective editing of videos and skewed memories of witnesses. The defense emphasized his long service record, portraying him as a dedicated officer who had spent years protecting his community, navigating complex situations with professionalism. They argued that confrontations arose from difficult circumstances, not racial animus, and that accusations of hate crime were exaggerated or politically motivated. Mason's demeanor as he testified was notable for its detachment. He spoke with a cold rationality that belied the human consequences of his actions, detailed by others. When confronted with specific incidents, the video of him violently dragging Esther, the testimony of his wife describing abuse in their home, Mason responded with denials, minimizations, or vague explanations. He asserted that he had been forced to act firmly for public safety and that private disputes were being weaponized against him. The jury listened intently as Mason recounted the events through his own lens. He claimed that the traffic stops, property disputes, and confrontations were procedural necessities, that he had followed protocol, and that any perception of bias was unfounded. His tone rarely wavered, projecting an air of stoic professionalism even as the prosecutor's evidence stacked against him. Yet beneath the surface, there was tension. In moments when pressed for details, Mason's eyes darted briefly, and his jaw tightened. He struggled to reconcile his words with the undeniable weight of video footage and testimony from multiple sources, including his own wife's damning confession. The courtroom atmosphere thickened with the implicit question, could this man's version withstand the scrutiny of truth laid bare before the jury? The prosecution meticulously dismantled Mason's defense. They replayed critical segments of the videos, emphasizing the disproportionate force, the racialized language, and the context of sustained threats. They recalled the pattern revealed by victim after victim, accounts not isolated but consistent, supported by evidence from years past. Each piece was woven into a tapestry depicting a man whose actions were far from routine enforcement. They were calculated, racially motivated acts of intimidation and violence. Throughout the defense's presentation, the contrast between Mason's cold, clinical narrative and the deeply emotional testimony of the victims was palpable. The jury was confronted with a stark divide. The human cost of Mason's actions, laid bare in the cries and scars of his victims, versus the detached, procedural justification offered by the defendant. Mason's lawyer attempted to portray the victims' stories as misinterpretations or misremembered incidents, arguing that the heat of the moment, combined with social tensions, had distorted perceptions. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, suggesting that some had motives to exaggerate or distort facts, and sought to create reasonable doubt by emphasizing gaps in the evidence. However, the prosecution countered by reinforcing the corroborated nature of the evidence. Multiple independent accounts, video recordings, medical documentation, and even Mason's history of complaints. The detailed timelines and the consistency of testimony across victims and witnesses made the defense's narrative increasingly fragile. In one particularly intense exchange, Mason was pressed about his treatment of Esther. He maintained that the force used was necessary to subdue a resistant subject and denied any racial motivation. But his tone faltered when reminded of his wife's statements and documented history of verbal abuse. He insisted those allegations were personal and unrelated to his official duties. The judge, observing the proceedings, maintained order and fairness but allowed both sides to fully present their case. The public gallery was quiet, save for the occasional muffled sniffle from victims' families. Journalists recorded every moment, aware that these testimonies would shape public understanding far beyond the courthouse walls. As Mason concluded his testimony, the defense made their closing points. Appealing to the jury's sense of doubt, they emphasized the burden of proof, reminding jurors that accusations must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and argued that Mason's years of service and lack of formal disciplinary actions reflected a man committed to his job. The prosecution's closing underscored the emotional and factual weight of the evidence, imploring the jury to recognize the pattern of abuse and hate that Mason had inflicted on innocent people. They argued that justice demanded accountability, not just for Esther, but for all victims of systemic violence. With both sides having presented their cases, the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence. The judge instructed the jury on their duties, emphasizing impartiality and the gravity of their decision. Then the jurors filed out to begin their deliberations. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered, awaiting news. Conversations buzzed with uncertainty and hope, reflecting the community's deep investment in the outcome. The trial had become more than just a legal proceeding. It was a crucible for the town's conscience. For Lena and the victims, the day marked a milestone, but also the beginning of an anxious wait. Would the jury see through Mason's defense and deliver justice? The answer would come soon, but the battle had already shifted from evidence to belief, from facts to human understanding. A courtroom clash, where chilling denials met undeniable evidence. The fight for truth and justice poised on a knife's edge. The atmosphere in the courthouse was electric, yet weighed down by the gravity of what was about to unfold. People filled every available seat, their eyes trained on the jury box, as the 12 jurors sat solemnly, their faces inscrutable behind the veil of duty. The room was suffused with a heavy silence, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel measured, every second stretched. Victims and their families, supporters, reporters, and residents shared a collective anticipation that could be felt in the very walls of the courtroom. In the front row, Esther sat with her daughter Lena beside her. Esther's hands trembled slightly, but her eyes remained steady, fixed on the jurors. Lena, a pillar of calm resolve, reached out once to squeeze her mother's hand, silently sharing strength. Across the room, Mason sat rigid, his expression carefully neutral. His defense attorney whispered, occasionally glancing toward the jury as if willing them to remain uncertain. But behind Mason's mask of stoicism, the tension was unmistakable. The judge entered, the rustle of her robes marking the start of the moment. She took her seat with quiet authority and called the courtroom to order. The jury foreperson rose, holding the folded verdict sheet tightly in his hands. Every eye was on him as he began to speak. In the case of the state of County versus Mason, on the charge of aggravated assault on a disabled person, he said, pausing as the words hung heavy in the air, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A ripple of breath escaped from the crowd. Some held back tears, others clenched their fists in relief. Esther exhaled quietly, her shoulders relaxing as though a long-held weight had finally lifted. The foreperson continued. On the charge of committing a hate crime as defined by state law, motivated by racial bias, his voice remained steady, we find the defendant guilty. This verdict carried a profound resonance, a formal acknowledgement that Mason's actions were not merely criminal, but driven by hatred and bigotry. The courtroom seemed to collectively exhale, the silence replaced by murmurs of affirmation. Mason's face, previously a mask of control, flickered momentarily with a shadow of something, shock, resignation, or disbelief. His hands tightened in his lap, knuckles pale. The judge spoke next, her voice measured and solemn. She reminded all present of the seriousness of the verdicts and the gravity of the consequences. The sentencing hearing would be scheduled soon, where Mason would face the full measure of the law for his crime. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. The media gathered quickly, broadcasting the verdict live. Crowds assembled on the courthouse steps, their faces a mix of joy, relief, and quiet contemplation. Local leaders spoke to the press about the significance of the decision, emphasizing that it was a victory not just for the victims, but for justice itself. Lena addressed the crowd with careful words. Today's verdict is a step forward, an affirmation that hate and violence have no place in our community. It is the beginning of healing and a call to continued vigilance. For Esther, the moment was deeply personal. Years of pain and silence culminated in this public vindication. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced her daughter, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had stood by her side. The sentencing hearing, held weeks later, brought renewed attention. Mason appeared before the judge, now stripped of his uniform and authority, a man exposed before the law and community. The prosecution detailed the breadth of his crime, the physical assault on a disabled woman, the decades of intimidation and racial harassment, and the corrosive impact of his actions on community trust. Victim impact statements played a central role in the hearing. Esther spoke with quiet dignity about the lasting scars Mason had inflicted, not only on her body, but on her spirit. Linda Mason's testimony from the trial echoed in the courtroom as a stark reminder of the hidden costs of his abuse. When sentencing was announced, 8 years in state prison, it was met with a profound mix of emotions. Supporters cheered softly, some wept openly, while others reflected silently on the long road ahead for true community healing. The judge emphasized the sentence's message that society would not tolerate hatred cloaked in authority, that protecting the vulnerable and holding abusers accountable was paramount. News outlets covered the sentencing extensively. Editorials praised the court's decision as a landmark moment for justice in a small town with a troubled past. Experts noted the importance of sentencing that recognized the dual nature of Mason's crimes: violent assault compounded by racial animus. The verdict sparked broader conversations beyond the courtroom. The governor, closely following the trial, publicly lauded the outcome and announced plans for legislative reforms aimed at strengthening hate crime laws and police oversight. Community forums were organized to discuss how to prevent such abuses in the future. A task force was formed, including legal experts, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement officials, charged with reviewing training, disciplinary processes, and community engagement. The goal was to rebuild trust and ensure that no person in the community would again face the kind of systemic abuse Mason represented. In the months following the verdict, the community slowly began to heal. Esther returned home, surrounded by a network of support. Lena continued her judicial duties with renewed commitment, knowing that the battle for justice extended far beyond this case. For the victims and their families, the verdict was more than a sentence. It was recognition, a promise that their voices mattered, and that justice was possible. For the town, it was an opportunity to confront painful truths and move toward a more just and equitable future. After years of silence and pain, justice was finally served, signaling not just the punishment of one man, but a community's commitment to change. The grand meeting room of the state capitol was charged with a palpable sense of urgency and purpose. It was more than just a routine gathering of officials. It was a historic turning point, a moment that would mark a profound shift in how the state addressed hate crimes and law enforcement accountability. Governor Elena Ramirez presided at the head of a long, polished table, surrounded by key figures from the state police, legal experts, community advocates, and notably, Judge Lena Evans and attorney Simone Rivers. Their presence was a testament to the weight of the issue at hand, a tragedy borne by one community that demanded systemic change. Governor Ramirez began by framing the crisis brought to light through the Mason case as not an isolated event, but a reflection of deep-rooted failures within law enforcement and judicial systems. She announced a bold executive order mandating comprehensive anti-racism and implicit bias training for all law enforcement officers statewide. Unlike past efforts, this new training would be continuous, immersive, and community-driven, designed to confront and dismantle the ingrained prejudices that had long compromised justice. Police Chief Jordan Bell, present in the room, acknowledged the department's shortcomings and expressed commitment to these reforms, understanding that the Mason case had exposed dangerous gaps. In addition to training, the governor detailed the deployment of new technology measures aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Every officer would be equipped with body cameras, and critical rural and urban areas would see expanded surveillance through strategically placed video cameras. Clear policies would govern the usage and accessibility of these recordings, ensuring they would serve justice rather than be hidden from scrutiny. Attorney Simone Rivers underscored how vital these tools had been during the Mason trial, where video evidence had been pivotal in establishing the truth. The governor also announced the establishment of an independent hate crime oversight committee, a multidisciplinary body comprising law enforcement representatives, legal professionals, civil rights leaders, and community members. This committee's mandate would be to monitor hate crime incidents, review law enforcement responses, and advise on legislation and community outreach efforts. Drawing from FBI statistics showing the alarming rise in hate crimes, with over 11,800 reported in the past year, more than half targeting Black individuals. The committee was positioned as a vital mechanism to ensure that cases like Mason's would never be dismissed or ignored. Throughout the meeting, community representatives voiced their hopes and frustrations, emphasizing the importance of accountability and ongoing dialogue between law enforcement and the people they served. The collective consensus was clear: systemic reform was no longer optional, it was imperative. Governor Ramirez pledged to collaborate closely with state legislators to codify these reforms into law, alongside launching public education campaigns to raise awareness and empower citizens to report abuses safely. As the meeting drew to a close, plans were finalized for a major press conference to publicly announce the reforms, symbolizing a new chapter in justice and community partnership. Lena and Simone exchanged a look of cautious optimism, recognizing that while the indictment of Mason was a significant victory, true justice required transformation beyond one trial. In the quiet aftermath, Lena reflected on the journey, from a mother's suffering to a courtroom battle, and now to systemic change. The path ahead was long, but the seeds of reform had been sown. Justice, she knew, demanded not only accountability, but courage and vigilance. With hope rekindled, the state prepared to face its future, one shaped by lessons learned, commitment renewed, and a promise that no community would again suffer in silence. The early morning sun spilled over the horizon, washing the freshly mown grass of the Evans farm in a soft golden light. Where once the earth had borne witness to pain, division, and the scars of injustice, there now rose an atmosphere of hope and renewal. The grounds had been meticulously prepared for this day, an event unlike any the community had seen before. Bright banners fluttered gently in the breeze, each one adorned with the words, "Justice Roots," a name that was both symbolic and deeply meaningful. It spoke to the land, yes, but more importantly, to the foundation of justice and healing that had begun to take root among these people. Neighbors, friends, and strangers alike had gathered, their faces a tapestry of emotion, relief, pride, hope, and cautious optimism mingling in the cool morning air. Black and white, old and young, They stood shoulder to shoulder, a living testament to the power of unity. It was a celebration not just of a legal victory, but of a community's strength to confront its wounds and begin to heal. At the heart of the crowd stood Esther Evans. Time had softened the lines of pain on her face, but the fire in her eyes burned as brightly as ever. She walked with the aid of her cane, each step deliberate and strong, the genuine smile that played on her lips a testament to the journey she had undertaken. Around her, those who knew her whispered stories of her resilience. The woman who had faced unimaginable violence and discrimination but refused to be broken. Beside her was her daughter, Judge Lena Evans, clad in a jacket boldly embroidered with the phrase, "Equal Justice," across the back. It was a symbol of her dual role as both a daughter who had witnessed her mother's suffering and a jurist who had fought to see that justice prevailed. Her calm presence lent a sense of solemnity and strength to the occasion. Lena's eyes scanned the crowd with a mixture of pride and humility, fully aware that this day was a culmination of countless acts of courage, persistence, and hope. Near the stage stood Jamal, the passionate host whose voice had carried this story from local tragedy to national consciousness through relentless live streams and media appearances. His crew was in the final stages of wrapping up their broadcast, capturing the historic moment for thousands watching remotely. With a satisfied sigh, Jamal tapped the end stream button, signaling the close of the live broadcast. His smile was broad, the weariness of months of tireless work softened by the overwhelming sense of achievement. Gathered around them were representatives of the state government and local law enforcement, the police chief, several legislators, and community leaders, each present to witness and affirm a collective commitment to justice and reform. Their presence underscored the gravity of the moment. This was not just about past wrongs, but about forging a new path forward. The centerpiece of the event was the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Justice Root Center, a facility established on the farm's grounds to serve as a hub for legal assistance, victim support, and community education. The building itself was modest but welcoming, its walls painted in warm colors, adorned with murals representing unity and strength. The center was the physical embodiment of the community's resolve to transform pain into empowerment. As the crowd's applause swelled, Esther, Lena, and Jamal approached the ribbon stretched taut across the entrance. In a symbolic act witnessed by all, the trio grasped the ribbon and tore it apart together, the colorful fabric fluttering to the ground like the last barrier between the past and a hopeful future. Taking to the podium, Lena's voice rang out clear and steady, carrying the weight of experience and the lightness of new beginnings. "We have traveled a long road together," she said, her eyes meeting those of the crowd, not to seek vengeance, but to build, to construct a community rooted in justice, respect, and compassion. Her words ignited cheers and tears, a powerful reminder that the fight had never been about retribution but about rebuilding what hatred had sought to destroy. Jamal stepped forward, his enthusiasm infectious. He announced the launch of the Listening Circles, a series of community meetings designed to foster open, honest conversations between residents and law enforcement officers. The goal was clear: to break down barriers, address fears and misunderstandings, and rebuild trust. These circles would be held across schools, churches, and community centers, bringing people together to share their stories and listen deeply. The crowd responded with applause, energized by the tangible steps being taken to heal fractured relationships. Then the police chief took center stage, signing a publicly displayed memorandum that committed his department to mandatory anti-bias training, comprehensive use of body cameras, and active cooperation with the newly formed Hate Crime Oversight Committee. His signature was more than ink on paper. It was a public vow that systemic failures would be confronted, and that accountability would be the new standard. Children played nearby, their laughter weaving through the crowd like a hopeful melody. Elders nodded knowingly, recognizing that this day marked a turning point. Conversations sparked spontaneously as neighbors exchanged stories, hopes, and renewed faith. The Justice Root Center welcomed its first visitors that afternoon, survivors seeking counseling, families looking for legal advice, and volunteers eager to contribute. The center quickly became a sanctuary for healing, a place where voices long silenced found a safe space to be heard. Beyond the farm, the ripple effects grew. Legislators, inspired by the case, drafted new bills to strengthen hate crime laws and enhance police oversight. The governor publicly endorsed the reforms, promising sustained funding and political support. Statewide forums were convened to discuss best practices and encourage community engagement. The listening circles spread rapidly, creating opportunities for frank dialogue and fostering empathy between officers and citizens. Difficult conversations took place, some painful, others hopeful, but each was a building block toward trust and reconciliation. Lena remained deeply involved, often visiting the center and attending circle meetings. She understood that justice was an ongoing journey, not a final destination. Esther's transformation from victim to advocate inspired many, her story a beacon of resilience and hope. The community itself began to shift. Police policies were revised, officers received new training, and civilian oversight boards grew stronger and more engaged. Neighborhoods once divided by suspicion started to reconnect, their bonds strengthened by shared commitment to fairness and respect. Yet, beneath the triumph lay the sobering truth that healing would take time. The scars left by years of neglect and abuse were deep, and vigilance was required to prevent regression. As the sun set over the Justice Roots Center, soft music played over the speakers, a gentle anthem of perseverance and unity. Lena stepped to the microphone for the closing words of the day. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And, today, together, we have taken the first steps on a path toward a future where every person's dignity is respected, every voice is heard, and every heart can heal. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in a chorus of hope and determination. Flags waved, banners fluttered, and smiles shone brightly. This was not the end, but a pause. The story of Esther and her community teaches us that justice is not just about court rulings, but about courage, unity, and the voices of those who refuse to stay silent. True change happens when people come together to demand fairness and dignity for all. Do you believe the reforms sparked by this case can truly reshape the system? What role will you play in building a fairer society? Share where you're watching from and your thoughts in the comments below.